So it is my honor and delight to welcome our plenary speaker and to introduce Leslie. Leslie Jonas is a native Cape Codder, an elder Eel Clan member of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. She is an experienced planning and development strategist with a demonstrated history of working in tribal governments and nonprofits. She is skilled in management, communications, event planning, client relations, and nonprofit work, specifically Indigenous land and water conservation, with a focus on climate change, cultural preservation of lifeways, and environmental justice. As a founding board officer, Leslie has spent the last 12 years helping to build the first Native-led land conservation trust east of the Mississippi, the Native Land Conservancy. During the past many years, Leslie has been researching and focusing on climate change from the Indigenous perspective and producing educational video tools, a Connecting with the Natural Elements video series on earth, water, air, and fire for audiences across many disciplines. Currently, she advises an Indigenous environmental course in social environmental justice in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, speaking publicly on climate change, rewilding, cultural respect, traditional ecological knowledge, and environmental self-determination. Leslie is an advisory board member for the State of Massachusetts Conservation Law Foundation, sits on the state's Justice 40 Advisory Board, and is on the Advisory Commission for the Cape Cod National Seashore, and was named a Keystone Cooperator by UMass Amherst's Keystone Project last fall. Leslie currently works as a research administrator and tribal liaison for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, providing grant support to scientists in their work to support our coastal communities, and has worked closely with the Institute's chief DEI officer on building a relationship with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. She is also DEI certified from Cornell University, holds a BA in Mass Communications and Television Production from Emerson College, and a master's degree in Community Economic Development. Please help me welcome Leslie.
Wani Kisak, it's good to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to the NESAF annual meeting. My heart lives in the woods of Cape Cod, so it's really a pleasure to be here. Natasuis, Mikwan Nipawak, Nitomas Masipiat, Katapatanamu, Wachi Aki, Wachi Katahanash Ka Awasak. My native name is Standing Feather. I am Mashpee Wampanoag. I'm really appreciative, like I said earlier, of being with you today, and I'm truly grateful for all land, water, and for all creatures. I am a passionate land and water conservationist and enthusiast. I grew up on Cape Cod and was blessed enough to be raised by a mixed race family made up of Cape Verdean, Portuguese, and Wampanoag people who all lived and still live very close relationally to the Cape's land and water. We responsibly farmed and we foraged the land. We hunted and we fished the waters for sustenance. As a young middle schooler in the 70s, I worked for the New Alchemy Institute, founded in 1969 in Falmouth. I was lucky enough to live not even a mile down the road where my parents built our first home and where my mom still lives today. New Alchemy is now called the Green Center and is a pioneering research institute that investigated organic farming, agriculture, aquaculture, and bioshelter with very little reliance on fossil fuels. It was cutting-edge technology at the time, creating alternative systems that would set the tone for a greener future. The Institute's research work discovered and modeled greener, self-sustaining systems, pioneering avenues in biotech research and design way, way ahead of its time. The founders, John and Nancy Todd, and William McLarney's mission was to restore the lands, protect the seas, and inform the Earth's stewards, developing ecologically derived food, water, and shelter, and energy systems, while completely rethinking how such systems were designed. Together, these pioneers aimed to redirect the trajectory of technology development for humanity's future. So my job was to help these alchemists maintain the land in order to research human support systems of food, water, and shelter, and very importantly, to completely rethink and replan how these systems were designed. So my job was to prepare garden beds and create compost piles the size of small houses. We built fences and stone walls to keep certain creatures in and other creatures out. This early work so far in my life has been my all-time favorite job, and the bonus was that I learned how to drive a 3-speed on the column Ford pickup at 12 years old. I felt more alive doing this work than I have felt doing anything else. But today, this work is far more complicated and political, so I long for the days of a past innocence and even ignorance in what lied ahead. Over the past 13 years, 12 according to my bio, as a founding board officer, I helped to build the Native Land Conservancy, which is the first Indigenous land conservation trust east of the Mississippi. And our mission is to, quite simply, preserve, restore healthy landscapes for all living things wherever possible. We draw upon our collective traditional cultural knowledge as Indigenous peoples with generations of direct experience in the woodlands, coastlines, and waterways of our ancestral homelands. We are headquartered in Mashpee on Cape Cod, and now have become a national organization holding land in conservation throughout Massachusetts in the green, with conservation restrictions on land in Alabama with the Muskogee people in purple. We hold cultural respect easements, which I'll get into in a little bit, on 460 acres, and we hold conservation restrictions and easements on 811 acres throughout Massachusetts and again in Alabama. So the focus of our work is Indigenous land conservation. And what does that mean? It's really about cultural respect. And we do this by rescuing and preserving open spaces for everyone, but specifically for the continuation of Indigenous cultural lifeways. So we work in and with our tribal and land conservation communities much of the time, but now more and more we're joining other groups with shared values in land conservation and preservation projects. In our environmental management practices, we work with the natural ecosystems for a holistic plan of sustainability and revitalization, always keeping the natural world at the forefront, but also understanding the grave losses that we've seen in these habitats, so we consistently seek to stabilize them. We work to protect, revitalize, and restore native plant species to reinvigorate these ecosystems that have kept the land and the water in balance for millennia. There are various kinds of conservation and preservation tasks of the natural world, and some groups have asked us to join them in their rewilding efforts to revitalize certain sites. Sites that have sustained extractive impact and pollution and really, truly need to heal. However, Indigenous cultural survival on homelands can offer up occasional opposing views on the more rigid rewilding concepts in the land conservation movement. It's without a doubt that human impact to our natural world has harmed and polluted her to the point of devastation to the lands and waters, threatening our existences and all species beyond, I think, what we ever imagined. And so we understand that rewilding is well-meaning. We also understand what climate and pollution have done and continue to do to our Earth Mother. Climate change and pollution are at levels far higher and moving at rates far faster than scientists could have even predicted 50 years ago. And while the science was telling us that radical change had to happen, nothing happened for decades. So it is in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy teachings that say we are a part of everything, everything that is beneath us, above us, and around us. Our past is our present is our future, and our future is 7 generations, past and present. The Haudenosaunee are the people of the Longhouse. The Confederacy is made up of the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas, and was intended as a way to unite the nations and create a peaceful means of decision-making. This teaching of we are part of everything has always resonated with Indigenous cultures because it represents the power of equality and balance, and removing the threats of vertical power structures, ones that invite discord, animosity, and turmoil, and also reminding us of the value and the importance of lateral leadership models. As with the Haudenosaunee and many tribes across this country, we divide groups of related people, our families, into clans. Like the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, we trace our clans through the maternal line. In our Wampanoag culture, our family clans are symbolized by animals from the 3 earth elements of land, water, and air. Currently, we have 8 clans in the tribe: the bear, eagle, rabbit, otter, turtle, beaver, eel, and deer clans. I'm a member of the Wampanoag Eel clan, so it comes naturally to me to be very committed to water. It was Rachel Carson in Silent Spring who said, "The more clearly we can focus our attention on the wonders and realities of the universe about us, the less taste we shall have for destruction." Mankind has gone very far into an artificial world of his own creation. He has sought to insulate himself with steel and concrete from the realities of earth and water as he goes farther and farther into experiments for the destruction of himself and his natural world. In contemplating the exceeding beauty of the earth, there is symbolic as well as actual beauty in the migration of birds, in the ebb and flow of the tides, in the folded bud ready for spring. There is something infinitely healing in these repeated refrains of nature, the assurance that dawn comes after night and spring after winter. Carson's passionate concern in Silent Spring was with the future of the planet and all life on Earth. She called for humans to act responsibly, carefully, and as stewards of the living Earth. Silent Spring inspired the modern environmental movement. However, the conservation movement from the early 20th century was different from the environmental movement of the late 20th century. And it became more apparent after 1950, these movements were also different from the preservation movement. Rewilding has been a topic of discussion in the conservation movement in the US for 40 plus years, so it's not really new. It's been in Europe for far longer than that. However, the conservation, environmental, and preservation movements paved a way for what was considered a radical move to rewilding, with early criticism accusing it of dividing humans and non-humans. And while this movement tries to align with many Indigenous philosophies and practices, it has been historically fairly non-Indigenous and therefore can blindly marginalize Native people. By its very nature as a movement about reconnecting to place, rooting oneself, and returning to pre-industrial solutions, practitioners often unknowingly erase, ignore, overlook important traditional knowledge and vital histories, thwarting real community and environmental healing. This approach of no human impact is based in a culture of white imperialism, and thus the reason why many Indigenous groups and allies see it a bit differently. We believe that the natural world needs human impact, healthy, reciprocal exchange in all of our wellness. In popular culture, rewilding is meant to restore landscapes that were damaged by people, ultimately removing human restoration interventions from the landscape once the land has recovered enough for nature to flourish on its own. What began in the US in the 80s as an approach to ecological restoration called rewilding has been viewed by many Indigenous environmentalists and experts as a form of environmental colonialism. And it is in this mindset where the confusion began. We found in the definition by leading Western scientists that rewilding concerns safeguarding and restoring native biodiversity through large-scale interconnected networks of reserves established primarily to protect interacting keystone species and their trophic relationships, that it fostered a disregard for Indigenous culture and traditional ecological knowledge, or tech, which I'll be referring to a lot in a little bit, and I'll be calling it tech, a knowledge based in ancient wisdom passed down through generations of people living in relationship in kinship to the land and water. A kind of human relation to the land and water that always has and always will be in balance and beneficial for all living creatures. Now, we all know what keystone species are. They are those species which have extremely high impact on a particular ecosystem relative to its population. These species are also critical for the overall structure and function of an ecosystem. Keystone is often a dominant predator whose removal allows a prey population to explode and often decreases overall diversity. So keystone species hold together that complex web of relationships in an ecosystem. They can be animals, plants, or even microorganisms. It's been cited that indigenous land management practices globally manage lands storing 17% of the world's forest carbon and harbor more biodiversity than the world's protected areas. Protecting indigenous peoples and local communities' rights to their lands and water has the potential to make a significant contribution to that solution. A report from the Rights and Resources Initiative, the Woods Hole Research Center, and Environmental Defense Fund shows that indigenous peoples and local communities worldwide manage massive amounts of carbon in the trees and soil of their forests. At least 293,061 million metric tons, and that number's growing. Scientists estimate that by managing the world's land more sustainably, such as by protecting forests and investing in reforestation, we could achieve up to 37% of emissions reduction necessary to limit the global rise in temperature to 2 degrees Celsius by 2030. So there were a few rewilding pioneers, but it was this guy, Michael Soule, an American biologist, who brought forward and developed an ecological restoration approach of rewilding in the mid-90s. He surmised that large carnivores need big, wild, roadless areas of habitat for security from humans and to fulfill their survival needs. Few protected areas in North America or anywhere in the world are large enough to stand alone as habitats. Therefore, core habitats needed to be linked by wildlife movement corridors or landscape permeability. Thus, Soule's concept of the 3 C's of rewilding were carnivores, cores, and connectivity. What was missing from this earlier rewilding theory and concept was indigenous knowledge and an apparent widespread absence of any historic knowledge of traditional tenure on these lands. And the demise of native ecological systems, as Winona LaDuke, an environmental activist, so fervently describes in her book, All Our Relations, she says more recent data cites that the reintroduction of native species to be left alone to heal and thrive without human interaction comes with both benefits and risks. According to the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is the world's largest and most diverse environmental network, a misunderstanding of rewilding is that various applications of the rewilding concept have harmed communities and biodiversity and actually can threaten to undermine the approach altogether. Now, this has become of great concern to Native communities as this notion of reversing biodiversity loss to create wild spaces and landscapes can appear dismissive and a form of continued erasure of indigenous cultures. Essentially, poorly or mismanaged rewilding carries for both biodiversity and local people. The idea of allowing nature to reclaim areas that no longer are under human management or impact has garnered quite a bit of attention in the conservation movement as an optimistic, proactive approach to conservation. Well-intentioned governments, NGOs, communities, and individuals are more frequently adopting rewilding strategies. But of major concern is in the basic principles, which are in many cases inconsistently defined and often misrepresented and sometimes misapplied. However, wilderness movement leader Bob Marshall feels that there's an unfortunate misunderstanding, which is that the wilderness idea somehow erases indigenous people from the landscape. And instead, he states that the idea of wilderness was a reaction against the modern new order of environmental threat. It was certainly not at variance with the Indigenous people or their sustainable life ways, which in fact wilderness literature often romanticizes. So are these conflicting or intersecting perspectives and beliefs on the human-nature relationship? And by this very token, one of the Native Land Conservancy's partners, the Northeast Wilderness Trust, or NUT, headquartered in Montpelier, they've been amazing stewards of rewilding or forever wilding for quite some time now. Through our sometimes differing perspectives on rewilding, we wholeheartedly respect NUT for their steadfast commitment to rewilding. Thousands and thousands of acres of beautiful forests and the protection of over 254 miles of rivers and streams, with the belief that nature deserves the freedom to flourish, and in their words, are open to the public for quiet, slow recreation. So, I've given you both sides. When both concepts and applications of rewilding are well-informed and mindful, including the local Indigenous knowledge or native science, that we agree. Rewilding can certainly be well applied. But what would this take? Preserving and learning from traditional knowledge, culture, and language is necessary and a vital contribution to restorative culture. We learn from traditional place-based knowledge everywhere, also in Western culture. Transformative innovation for a regenerative culture is also about asking ourselves, how do we re-indigenize and adapt to place, to adapt to a home, while maintaining planetary awareness and global collaboration among all of humanity? For many Indigenous cultures, to address the false separation between nature and culture requires us to acknowledge that learning from human ingenuity and long-term adaptations to particular environments is also about learning from nature. Among Indigenous peoples, there's a long tradition of solving human problems by learning from other species and from the wider natural processes of which we are all part. This, in and of itself, is traditional ecological knowledge in a broader sense. It's our innate relationship to the natural world. In building climate resilience, sovereign tribal nations often work with a variety of partners in innovative ways to integrate traditional ecological knowledge or Indigenous knowledge with technology tools and diverse research methods to effectively address climate change and related impacts, but in a culturally appropriate community context. This is critically important because Indigenous people have been they've typically stayed and lived in their same areas, their homelands, for thousands of years. We acknowledge and have always acknowledged our responsibilities to our Earth Mother so that nature and all of its species continue. There exists a reciprocal relationship with the land as keepers of tradition, as the original stewards. In Dr. Robin Wall-Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, she states that Indigenous or indigenous to place is a birthright. And she asks this important question: if people do not feel Indigenous, can they nevertheless enter into the deep reciprocity that renews the world? I've been following this Indian law expert, Rebecca Shosi. She's a Yaqui Indian law scholar who teaches and has written quite extensively on environmental self-determination, the right of Indigenous peoples to remain on our homelands. She talks a lot about adaptation strategies as it relates to climate change being potentially genocidal for many groups of Indigenous people, and instead she argues for recognition of an Indigenous right to environmental self-determination. This allows Indigenous people to remain on their homelands. In this context of climate change policy, such a right would impose affirmative requirements on nation states to engage in mitigation strategies and work with the tribes in order to avoid such climate-related catastrophic harm to the Indigenous people of these areas. Environmental self-determination for Indigenous people is critical to the protection of our lives, our culture, and our future generations, and there's a lot that can and should be done in terms of mitigation, and environmental justice, but in an intercultural, cross-cultural framework, and one that recognizes rights to cultural survival. So we've been talking a bit about traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, which is identified by many names that you all hear. Traditional ecological knowledge, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, native science, indigenous science, ways of knowing. It goes on and on. They're all descriptions and titles for ancient bodies of knowledge or stories that get passed down through indigenous communities over generations and generations of time. It evolves. It's nonlinear. It's abstract and very qualitative. It's place-based. It's very inclusive. And there's this coexistence of relationships that span over long, long periods. It's changing based on our changing environment. So the stories that my grandparents told me, I've changed to adapt, that I share with my child. And it will continue to change based on an evolving, changing world. So these knowledge systems are developed by indigenous communities over a very long period of time, as I mentioned. You can see here in this diagram, it includes belief systems, it's very spiritual, there's a good sense of moral judgment that's included, and there are skills that are required, skills that are developed over long periods of time based on relationship with the natural world. They come from experiences, it's very experiential. This is knowledge honed over millennia from observations and connections, very place-based, and tend to recognize detail in a natural place like species populations, habitat, biodiversity of the biota or the native flora and fauna, all framed by a community and their relationship, their cultural worldviews in relationship to this specific place. These ancient knowledge systems, like I said, evolve and they have to change. The natural world has changed, so the stories that my grandfather shared and my father shared with us, the natural world is far different. It's unfortunately more polluted and damaged over the 100 and past 50 years that they passed these stories down to us. These stories are called oral tradition in Native cultures, and they happen based on decades and centuries of observing and being in relationship, in kinship with the outdoors. And the modifications and adjustments we've been making have to continue in order to stay connected, to adapt, to preserve precious cultural life ways. But in current times, we have to interpret the changing information differently to preserve that link. It's a multi-layered web of history, information, translation, and transmission of information, time, spiritual connectedness, experiences, and culture. It's about people living with and on land and water from which they come. So how tech is conceptualized is of the utmost importance to avoid some of the more common problems that are happening now that it's a much more trending concept to include in science specifically. So we don't want to see some of these common problems in misappropriation and misrepresentation happen. So by all means, if you're looking to incorporate tech in some of the work that you're doing, you want to connect with the community of the area, the native communities, and build a relationship, a rapport. Trust has to be developed. One cannot just expect that someone's going to share this ancient body of knowledge that's held here and here. So we talk about in more modern times how we begin to build a directory, a library, how we catalog different bodies of knowledge and how people are able to access it. Who owns it? It's proprietary. Tribes own it. So, and there's a way to merge these systems, Western science and Native science, to bring about much more robust solutions to some of our problems that we're facing in the environment. That trust in the relationship building is key. There's no fast tracking that. I I work for the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution daily, and I'm building that bridge right now with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and Hui, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And it's taking time, and I'm the live bloodline right to the tribe. However, we're not going to just give up these ancient knowledge systems. Processes are being developed, relationships are being developed, community is being enhanced. What is the relationship? Will be the question that you guys have when you try and want to incorporate tech in your future work. How will the tech that you acquire be passed on to next generations? These are real stories. This is a reality. It's so much about reciprocity in a place. It's relational. How does a community see an appropriate expression of that? How will they want to share that with you? And who will the future stewards be? These are some of the questions that we ask. So, all in all, we cannot remove the human from traditional ecological knowledge or native science and its application. It is community created. It's what's important to the community. It's the ways that they express themselves culturally. It's the different ways of knowing and living and interfacing with their natural world. And looking back and bringing those stories forward, how did our ancestors connect? So what is cultural respect? The Native Land Conservancy developed this concept for other conservation groups, for private landowners, for municipalities, local governments, and we first started with cultural respect agreements, and now it's more formal and it's called a cultural respect easement. And basically, it is the protection of Indigenous people's access to land, often on Massachusetts land trust lands in our case. It's respect for Indigenous people's historical connection and contemporary relationship with these very lands, and ensuring that Indigenous people feel welcome on their land, free from any possibility of harassment, discrimination, and even arrest. So entering into a cultural respect agreement or easement with our nonprofit, the Native Land Conservancy, makes the noble statement that you or your organization honor and respect the cultural continuation of Indigenous people, establishing a CRE, if we could call it that, rekindles Indigenous connectedness to the ancestral homelands. Cultural respect easement, or CRE, gives access to natives to conduct ceremony, renew oral tradition, and stories that are formally attached to these lands. So all of our lands have stories connected. They have history. And those stories are what need to continue, what need to be preserved and honored. And in many cases, we hold CREs with other groups to sustainably harvest and forage on their lands for whether it's food or medicine that we need, or maybe things for crafts that we use in the natural world. A CRE is the absolute closest expression of land rematriation to Indigenous people without an actual transfer of the deed, because it provides assurance for us to safely access areas of our ancestral homelands to exercise spiritual and cultural practices. It's pretty straightforward. So respect for our culture includes respect for our relationship with the earth, especially in areas where our ancestors foraged, prayed, sang, danced, lived, and were buried. And we still share that relationship with our Earth Mother today. We've been laser focused on cultural respect and the ways in which we can gain greater access to the natural world, land and water, without the threat of increased regulation and disrespect. So one of the ways that the NLC has led to inspiring change in this arena is through policy influence in Massachusetts in conservation restrictions. And as of June 11th, 2021, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts included important new language in its criteria for protecting and using land through conservation restrictions. This new language may be the first of its kind in the United States. These inclusions provide a means for Indigenous people to protect landscapes and features for their cultural significance and gain access for specialized foraging and ceremony through partnership with landowners, municipalities, and conservation groups. This is an important historic statement of recognition and a new level of sensitivity to the intrinsic values of the Indigenous peoples of Massachusetts. So CREs are tailored to the partnership and the place. Last December, now it's 2 Decembers ago, I think, the NLC recorded a CRE with the Dennis Conservation Land Trust. Dennis is a town on Cape Cod. And initially we had a 5-year cultural respect agreement with them, which meant that Native people could access their conservation land for 5 years. And we asked them, would you put a limit on the cultural ways in which people live, cultural life ways? And sometime later, they came back to us when the agreement was just about set to expire, the initial 5-year agreement. And with deepened understanding and partnership, the Dennis Conservation Land Trust expanded cultural access in perpetuity and to the entirety of their 80 sites held in conservation. So to us, this move, unprompted, demonstrated a uniquely sincere partnership. And very importantly, this level of engagement and trust is an extraordinary initiative of an authentic fellowship that will carry forward through generations to come. The conservation movement will become stronger through serving a larger swath of people and incorporating Indigenous knowledge. In fact, the conservation community, Indigenous people, and the land will all benefit from this cooperation and trust, essentially cultural respect. In closing, I'm going to share a video out of a 4-part series I've been producing for the NLC, for the Native Land Conservancy, on connecting with the natural world. I've done earth, air, and water, and this summer I'm producing fire. I'm going to share water with you because it describes the current condition of water and our relationship to it on Cape Cod, how it's impacting the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe and the natives of Cape Cod.
Water surrounds us. The ancestors taught us to respect the natural world, the earth and the water. Our original instruction was to live connected to the earth and water, to respect her, to honor her, to love her. Water is that which nourishes us. Water sustains all life.
Water is a precious element. It's a living thing itself. So joining with it, the water we drink, much of it comes from the sky. Some of it comes from underneath the earth. But it's passed through so many other things that we would actually drink it, and it gives us life forces from many different things. When it freezes, it has another effect on us. We live here where there's snowfall, sometimes lots of snowfall. We have to respect it in all of its forms.
Water is strength. Without it, we can't survive. Water flows, so it has teachings to us as well.
Water is survival for us. Water means that We come down to the water, we provide our food, the natural food that we eat to keep us healthy.
I feel the sustenance in it, but I also feel the energy of the water, because water is a living entity. The spirits that are in the water, the water plants, the fish that are there. Water is life to us. We can't live without the water. We can live without food, but we cannot live without water for any long period of time. The water that flows through our bodies, water that flows through Mother Earth. The water that flows through Mother Earth is the veins of Mother Earth. So without that water, Mother Earth will not survive.
One of the most special times in a woman's life when she births a child and she breaks water. That is our first time as human beings coming into this world. We're passing through water too.
We use water in our ceremonies, and women carry our water. And it's just so important and vital to our life as human beings on this earth.
When I think about the power of water, the first thing that comes to mind is currents and waves, the flow of the river, and how the fish and the herring need to flow.
When I go into the water, it's like entering a whole nother world. And that feeling inside of the water when you're just swimming through underneath the cold water, it's almost indescribable with words, just how incredible it feels to hold your breath and be in that space.
The power of water, you hear it, you see it, you smell it, you taste it, embrace it when you're with water.
One of the important things that I learned from my ancestors about water was it's our first medicine, so it's what I go to anytime I feel sick or hurt or uneasy.
Respect it and take what you need out of it. Don't ever overfish it, because when you overfish waters and taking out all your stuff and leaving nothing to seed, you only hurt yourself and your family. Because there's nothing ever going to come back in those spots. It's not only life for our people, it's life for every human being on this earth, is to keep this water clean.
The elders say that many have lost their way. Many have forgotten the teachings of our ancestors, their wisdom as culture keepers. If humans continue on this path of destruction, there will be nothing left. For Native peoples, this is dire, as everything we do, every thought that we have, every energy we put forth, considers the next 7 generations.
Cape Cod is sort of mostly a transient society where people are coming and going, mostly only in the summer. So they don't have a commitment to this land or the water. They have no relationship with it, other than it's the backdrop to their movie. For Indigenous people, we plan to be here. We've been here for over 12,000 years, and we intend to stay here. So some of us will be poisoned. That's a fact. We eat the shellfish, we eat the swimmers, the crawlers, crabs, anything that's even things that grow from contaminated water.
When I was a kid, you could just drink the water out of the lakes. Now you can't go to these ponds and you can't even swim in them anymore because of the boats and the pollution. When you go into an area like this, and years ago, 40 years ago, you would take 30 minutes to fill that basket. Now it takes me 3 water is life, because without the water, any of us will be here.
We have green algae blooms that, prevent us from swimming and prevent your daughters from being able to come in contact with the water. So, yeah, like summertime, and when it's so hot out, and the kids just want to be in the water swimming, and they can't even jump in because it's toxic.
And looking at the effects of climate change, what's going on this entire planet and our part of it here in the United States, I feel like, well, it seems obvious that we're not going to give up any of our comforts or conveniences, even if it's going to save the planet. And so, making those comforts and conveniences more healthy has to happen.
As we know, shellfish in particular, is a filter feeder. It cleans our waters. With less fish we got in here, the more pollution we're gonna have. The bay's been dying for more than 50 years. The bay's die every time you put a post down in there. It kills 5 feet or more, or even 12 feet around each post. It kills the shellfish around it. So years ago, there was hardly any docks here. There was fish here galore.
Well, we have to go back to a sustainable type of living, more so than what we have been doing. We've been in the other world for so long that we have forgotten how to live in a sustainable life.
When I go down and look at the heron that are running, go to catch some heron, there aren't as many as there used to be.
It makes me feel sad. It makes me feel sick. I can feel its pain. Because, in the natural spring-fed ponds that we have here in Massachusetts and Cape Cod, and when those natural springs can't do what they're supposed to, they're cleansing. They bring up the water from our aquifer so that we can have fresh drinking water. It hurts the animals, hurts the plant life that are there. What was naturally put there and inalienable rights, we can't use.
I know a lot of people don't believe in the old ways. But even we had many forms of purification in our culture. We use different substances, and people are looking at, sage and using it a lot, and sweetgrass to clean the air and bad energies, things like that. Chants, songs, sung to the water bodies.
But we have generations to come that we have to try to clean this up for them. So they have something at least to live on. So they can enjoy these woods and see these waters come back clean again. So that's our responsibility to take care of that.
In the future, I predict that we'll start to realize and wake up and understand that we can't keep doing things the same way over and over again, and that we'll start to correct some of these issues that are causing problems and start to find new ways of doing things that, allow us to keep the waters clean.
Right now, there's a few of us, elder gentlemen and a few people in our tribe are going back to find the springs that we had in the rivers and bring them back to life so we get that fresh, clean water.
I find it hard to talk about because it's really very painful how certain levels of ignorance can ruin the life for so many living things, and for other people, for now and into the future, will not be able to drink it or swim in it.
Protect it, nurture it, love it as it has you.
Water sustains us. We are made of water. It's part of our DNA. Without water, clean water, all life will end. Water is sacred.
Thank you, Katapatanamu.